We've listened a lot to the, by way of background, we've listened a lot to the questions regarding Clause 1, and they've come more from a legal background, they've come more from an administrative background. How do we deal with the issues which are occasioned by appointing the police commissioner rather than the chief health officer? I would very much like to take a more medical tack, as you would expect, because while in my particular approach, the use of the armed forces or the police in times of medical emergency I think it's absolutely necessary. But the question is going to be, does this fit the purpose? Now, it seems to me, by reading this, that what you're anticipating isn't so much a pandemic or indeed an epidemic, but putting the COVID-19 into an emergency situation which is being dealt with, but is now going to be transitioned into a more of a managing the state of the society. Am I correct in that thinking?
The Minister.
Thank you. Well, no, Honourable Member, I mean, we are trying to manage what is still a pandemic, albeit it's a pandemic that is starting to hopefully drop in case numbers, drop in severity, drop in hospital numbers, drop in numbers in ICU. Honourable Member, if you do, just while I'm on my feet, if you do have questions in relation to health, I do have a health advisor I can swap in. So if you, at the appropriate time, tell me.
The Honourable Dr Brown Walker.
Thank you, Minister. That is much appreciated. One quick question here. I mean, we've got at the moment a case fatality rate of 0.17%, which is about half that of the influenza, which we'd expect a 0.37% for case fatality rate. So the current state of emergency is, in those terms, less given. But I could well appreciate the risks, as the Honourable Steve Thomas mentioned yesterday, that viruses are well known for their ability to mutate. And they could mutate into a lesser form, or indeed a more virulent, a more dangerous form, which seems to be the case. I'm concerned about, say, the ZBB going through Singapore just now. That being the case, it is possible, maybe not certain, but not without the bounds of likelihood, that we could be getting a variant of COVID emerging, which would then have a significantly higher case fatality rate. Would that be correct?
The Minister.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I'm not sure what's ahead of us, Honourable Member. Certainly I've seen that in a number of countries around the world now, there are new variants starting to take hold, different variants in different places, in fact, at the same time. As to where they might end up, I'm not sure, but having lived through the last 2.5 years as the rest of us have, you'd be a brave person to bet on the outcome of the future.
The Honourable Dr Brown Walker.
Indeed, Minister, quite correct. I have lived through, as you heard yesterday, an epidemic in Hong Kong where the case fatality rate was 11%. And one of the first rules in major epidemics or pandemics, one of the first casualties isn't the bodies piling up, it's actually panic in the population. Hence, I would quite agree with the need for a very firm approach with the use of the police to manage societal unrest. That's a major casualty. And we could see that destroying the economy in Hong Kong when people working at the bank would refuse to go to work because they didn't want to bring the illness back to their families. And so business suffered quite greatly. So I can well appreciate the good intent of the government in the provisions in this bill so far. What I am concerned about is how are we going to implement the life-saving approaches with the help of this bill. And this is where I am at a little bit of a loss. One of the things which would have to happen is that we'd first of all have to recognise that a medical emergency was present, and we're looking here at the question of what's it called now? An infection which is declared an emergency, infectious disease extreme circumstance. Looking here at the Public Health Act 2016, which of course is always an operation. And in these cases, it says here in 202A, subsection 2, that the Minister may, in writing, make a declaration that an infectious disease extreme circumstance exists in the whole of the state or in any area or areas of the state. I would suggest that serious COVID variant transformation would merit this. And then I ask, who would be making the declaration? Would it be the Chief Health Officer or the Police Commissioner?
The Minister.
Look, we're not using the Infectious Diseases Declaration under the Public Health Act that you're talking about.
The Honourable Dr Brian Walker.
Indeed so. I am looking here at the comparability because the Public Health Act is seen in conjunction with the Emergency Management Amendment. They're both being presented together with the changes there. And I'm wondering if there isn't some crossed purposes here in the Emergency Management Act, translating some of the partition of the sections from the Public Health Act into the Emergency Management Act to allow for a semi-pandemic type approach. And let me explain here my concerns with this before I go on. That in the event of an epidemic of major proportions or a pandemic, they're both the same, just a question here of the extent of the infection, and panic being the first victim of that state, we're then going to be facing a quite awful situation. We had in a minor form the same thing with the first outbreaks of COVID, when in Merredin we found our IGA emptied by ravenous Perth citizens driving out to empty all the cities, the local towns of their produce, leaving the farmers without anything to eat or indeed toilet paper to clean their backsides with. And that was a natural response to people who are panicking and unable to actually manage. So panic makes the mental health of the population suffer. They do things which they wouldn't normally do, and it'd be quite aberrant. And looking at the situation where we do get faced by such a situation, I would be very concerned that the legislation that is being put forward right now would deal with a minor infectious disease, as the COVID at the moment seems to have degenerated into, but would not cater for the issues of a more serious variant. So my question to you is, has there been any input on this bill from those who are experienced in managing pandemics?
The Minister.
Thank you. Yes, the Chief Health Officer has had input into the bill.
The Honourable Dr Brian Walker.
And that being the case, thank you, Minister, that being the case, the question I have here also is referring to the Western Australian Government Pandemic Plan, which I have had a look through, and it's an admirable plan, but it's not something which can be put into action immediately. The problem being here that should a variant of COVID come through which requires urgent pandemic management, we do not yet have in place a push button which, when pushed, the pandemic legislation goes into place and action is taken without having to have meetings and discussions and coordinating groups and bringing together the great number of disparate professional groups which are all concerned to some degree with one aspect or other of the pandemic. So my question is, are we absolutely certain that the legislation as you have crafted with all good intent would meet that requirement?
The Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. So can I say that the WA Health Department, or the WA Health System, routinely manages minor epidemics and disease outbreaks through its disease surveillance and reporting systems. Such epidemics and outbreaks are not considered emergencies. Which legislation will be used in the event of another pandemic or epidemic depends on the nature of the situation and the response required. There's a range of powers available under both the Public Health Act 2016 and the Emergency Management Act 2005. Appropriate arrangements for response will be determined with reference to the WA Pandemic Plan. In addition, once the states of emergency end, work can commence to examine the suitability of relevant legislative frameworks to deal with pandemics. And that work, I think, will in turn provide clarity as to what is best in the long term to manage pandemics. New variants that sit outside COVID-19 can be dealt with, though, using existing provisions. The Public Health Act allows an infectious diseases extreme declaration to be made under Part 12, but this would be an escalation from the EMA COVID-19 declaration. That IDEC, or the Infectious Disease Extreme Declaration, is a health response, and the EMA bill is about the cross-agency coordinated response, how we would essentially work together collectively across government agencies to deal with issues broader than health.
The Honourable Dr Brian Walker.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Thank you, Minister. I am most reassured by that. I will ask no more questions. I'm very pleased to note that the issue regarding future pandemic needs and having a plan in place right now, which would actually be able to keep us safe in times of great emergency, are being contemplated in the not-too-distant future. So I thank you for that.
The question.
Thanks, Deputy
The
Chair.
Minister.
Thanks for your comments, Honourable Member. Can I assure you, no one is resting on their laurels, and people continue to work incredibly hard, as they have over the last 2.5 years, but they've moved to into a different space now. And certainly people are starting to think about life post the situation we find ourselves in. But of course, it's fair to say, having been through the last 2.5 years, I think there's a sense out there that it won't be 100 years till the next pandemic of extreme proportions. And so people are putting their mind to what's next, plans, etc. While planning had gone in for pandemics previously, in hindsight, was it cursory? I'm not sure. I'm not sure anybody, maybe perhaps there were some people, recognised what we might, find ourselves facing with a pandemic like COVID-19. But certainly work continues for life after that and what's next.